Hey, welcome everybody to the Geospatial Forum today on this almost last day of February. Not quite, right? Almost.
It would be.
It would be every other year. We've got Ferner, Ferner, who is a master's degree in forestry with GIS on top of that, and has been a manager for disaster response at Esri, and teaches courses for Johns Hopkins University in their GIS program. But she's also done many other really interesting things. And I met her at the users conference, the Esri users conference last year, and realized she lived in Saratoga. I'm like, you have to come give a talk. So here she is. Even though I-80 was closed between, she went the long way. So,
Oh, wow.
So thank you very much for coming today.
Absolutely.
And we are really excited to have you present in the Geospatial Forum. And so I will just let you take it away. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
So she stole my entire introduction. So my name is Chris Ferner. I have not gone by Chris since I was a wee one, because everyone who was born in the same year as I was named Chris or Christopher or Christina. So I've been Fern since I was in elementary school. So feel free, don't feel weird about calling me that. That's what I go by. As Beth said, I live over in Saratoga and came the long way. So if I start glazing over, it's because I haven't actually had any coffee yet today. That's okay. I think I'll be okay. I guess, yeah, to add to that, I'm adjunct faculty over at Johns Hopkins. Obviously, I don't live in Baltimore, so I am fully remote. It's their GIS program is 100% remote, as is their graduate level environmental sciences and policy. And I teach in both of those programs, and I'm excitedly developing a course to go to the Galapagos. So can't wait for that. We're going live in the spring. So it's almost completed, but I have like 25 more books to read before I pick which readings the students have to do. So my reading list is very big this year. I also work for the Yurok tribe. They are based in Northern California, and for them, I do wildfire, post-fire kind of rehabilitation, GIS projects, some consulting, and whatever else comes up. They just kind of joined them as a little bit of part-time help, because they need it in their area. So I still work in wildfire, and I'll get more into that, but I do maintain my fire qualifications. So I'll go to the next slide, get used to this keyboard. At the very top are some of the places that I've worked through my work in wildfire, the most recent being Esri. I do go out to fires through Denver West Metro Fire Department. That's officially who carries my qualifications. When I moved to Wyoming, no one would carry my qualifications, so I had to keep them in Colorado. It's a hard thing if you're not an agency employee of one of the big fire agencies, then it can be a little tricky to find somebody to manage that. And what does that mean? That means somebody makes sure that I'm qualified. They make sure I follow the annual recertification processes, which I'm doing right now, and they make sure that I get paid. So it's a very important piece of the puzzle. Let's see, I've been in fire for 25 years, and that sounds a lot bigger than it used to. Keeps getting higher, that number. Funny how that works. But these pictures are actually quite old. I was having fun finding pictures from fires I've worked on, and as you do this longer, you take fewer photos. So went back in time a little bit to look at some of these, and I may pop back over the slide later just to explain some of the pictures. But Esri, I worked there for about a decade, and I was there. Am I still in the? Okay. Make sure I'm not walking off the camera for the Zoom folks. So I was their wildfire specialist. My title changed about as many times as I was there in years. So I essentially got hired to work as one of the 4 people at the time on their disaster response program. And that program is kind of a philanthropic mission by Jack. That's the goal is to help people when they're having a really bad day, which aligns pretty closely to my personal mission, is to help people succeed at their jobs. And so to be able to do that, they needed to have somebody who they could essentially airdrop into disasters. So they actually picked me up off of a disaster, the 2013 flooding event in Colorado, when most of the bridges that traveled north-south were all washed out. And the canyons were pretty devastated. A lot of damage occurred. And it was my first flood. I'd been working fire for a while, 15 years at that point. And so they knew me. I kind of knew that Esri was the place I go get software, and that's about it. That was the extent of our relationship. And so they said, hey, we know you're on this fire. Do you need ArcGIS Online? I said, I don't know what that is, but I'll take anything that you've got, because it wiped out cell towers, it wiped out everything. The firefighters who were assigned to respond couldn't get to us because the bridges were all out. So they happened to be about 20 minutes away from where we were. So they popped over, gave me a demo. And after sleeping under a desk similar to this that night, because I couldn't get anywhere, I woke up the next day and I couldn't remember what buttons to click. So I sent them a very nice email and said, thank you, but I apologize, I'm not going to use this new tool. And so after that, after I was done working on the flood, they brought me on board. They said, obviously, there's a little bit of user need for somebody to be able to translate. And I was like, I've been using GIS for 15 years at that point. It wasn't just pick up and run with it. And they kind of thought it would be for somebody who, with my level of experience. So I worked for them. Before that, I'll finish this one before I squirrel away too far. I do have, fire is not a job in GIS where you get a job and you keep it for your entire career with one agency, unless if you get one of the 10 positions that are GIS that are permanent at the federal level for the Park Service. There are a few more than that for the Forest Service, but most of them fire is an other duty as assigned. And since fire has been my primary, thus I worked for various agencies as a result of that. Boulder County Sheriff's Office was one of my longer ones, Esri was, and Colorado State Forest Service. The federal positions were all fairly seasonal or just a few years of work. Outside of fire, because fire is not everything that encompasses Fern. I was raised by a biologist and an ecologist, and this very much contributed to where I ended up and where I am today. My dad is was a biology professor, herpetologist. So when I would decide that I was sick, I would get to go to college. So third grade was my favorite year to be sick and go hang out in the biology dissecting lab. So I knew what days he had lab, and conveniently I was ill quite a bit that year. But as a result, we were always in the woods. We were looking for lizards, tagging lizards, investigating, watching and learning, and constantly critiquing and cataloging everything. And that fell into kind of where I ended up pretty well. You might be thinking that sounds really far away from sitting at a computer processing data and doing data management. And it is, but it's a similar level of detail and analysis and looking at the data. And so it also made me really focus on conservation. And because of his work, the countries, see, I like starting with the map, the countries that are highlighted, there's 5 of them. I lived in all of those countries before I was 22. I lived in the US, Germany, and Sierra Leone, West Africa before I turned 17. And no, again, not a military kid, he was a scientist. So we were off looking for things. And then I went to Germany on my own after returning back to where we lived in the US at the time and discovering that high school just wasn't Fern friendly. So I moved to Germany and did a couple years in Kreisgymnasium there, which is like college. So it was an adventure. But all of these things kind of brought me to where I then landed once I returned. I went to school, college, I discovered that, gosh, growing up with a biology professor and then picking biology as your degree, piece of cake. I felt a little like I was cheating, but I spent most of my time doing international studies. So I finished my biology degree pretty quick and then moved into the international realm, and kind of GIS was still fairly new at that point. So it wasn't something that was being taught. My dad actually took a class and sent me the book. And I went through the book and I said, wow, that was easy. I'm gonna go get a master's in this. And that's what I did. So I moved, our family had lived part-time in Colorado. And so I moved back and took over the family property and went to school and got my degree at CSU. But let's kind of refocus on GIS and fire. And I decided Monday, while I was driving across the great, very long state of Nebraska, to change it up a little bit today. So I drove across Nebraska on Monday. I might be one of the few people. I think Nebraska is beautiful, and there's so much. I mean, it's not like stunning mountains like driving down I-70 through the Rockies. It's not like driving through Banff, but it has so much small detail. There's a lot of wildlife. And as I crossed from Iowa in, I was like, gosh, that looks like smoke. And I was like, no, it can't be smoke. And then I was like, oh, it's really windy. That's probably smoke. For the next many hours, I was much more entertained because I had smoke to watch, which as a fire, I guess I consider myself a little bit of a student of fire, which is a Paul Gleason term. He had a long career in fire, started in the 60s and ended at CSU as a professor in their fire sciences program. And his philosophy was that we are all students of fire. No one is really an expert. We learn every fire that we look at is different. And yes, there's a lot of similarities, but you're constantly looking at, well, how is it burning? How is it behaving? What is it doing? And all of those things are data. And so when we're thinking about fire, yes, it's a real tangible thing, but we record all of those observations. And everything that we record goes into GIS, gets analyzed, gets modeled, and gets put out as predictions for the next incident. So this is, I've spaced the name, it'll come up in 2 slides. This is the fire over in Nebraska, 72,000 acres, I think. Got to watch it all through the smoke. Had a couple, at one point I saw 3 distinct little columns happening, and it was blowing so hard though that it was very hard to see, and it kind of dissolved back into a wind-driven plume or cloud across the entire state. So after working at the Esri disaster response program for a decade, it's changed how I think. So I think, oh, I wonder if there's a map. So of course I had to stop, look at a map, get some gas. And this is what I found. And I was like, okay, it's a new incident, grass fires, rural area. I'm going to assume some of you are from Wyoming. Is anyone from Wyoming? Just a couple? Okay.
You're long enough.
Yep. Same. So, you know, I feel like we can get away with a little bit less in terms of mapping in rural areas. Say if this was happening in Colorado or California, you would want more, right? This is their evacuation. This is the most I could find about the evacuations. And I'm like, okay, well, they all know where they are. Do they really need a better map? Well, who's going there to fight the fire? Not the locals. They're busy. So the firefighters coming in probably want to know a little bit more. Not being there, not knowing, it's hard to say. But take a minute and read that.
Yeah, where he lives are.
And with my just under 16-year-old niece, and she got to drive my car a lot. And so having a student driver mindset now, I was like, oh wow, no way. No. Hard no. Like I would not be letting her drive around working on some fires that have impacted schools. That is extremely traumatic and stressful.
Just have him go first.
Yeah, you get out there, like, just go, yes, you've got the keys, right? Yeah, off you go. But when you're trying to get people out of the way, you do what you could do. And so that absolutely is a logical thing in a rural community. Yeah, the kids are more mature, they are more advanced, but I want to know where they sent them and where they're going and where that school is and where the fire was. It was north of Highway 1, but how far away was the school from Highway 1? There's a lot of questions that this raised for me and a lot of concerns over how could we as GIS professionals help this process be more efficient and safer? Because that's really what we can do. So then I ended up actually staying in North Platte, which is where the fire started, right north of North Platte. I've been traveling since midnight Sunday night. And so got tired, stayed there. And then when I made it home to Saratoga yesterday morning, I pulled up an app that I helped make while I was at Esri. And I looked at the map and I said, well, that's interesting. So this is one of my favorite wildfire maps because it's publicly available. And it has 22 or 24 authoritative data sources in it. What does authoritative mean? It means it's coming from the source, from the agency or entity that is responsible for the creation and management of that data. So the source that we're getting that data from is providing it directly to Esri's Living Atlas, and they're maintaining that update, and they're required to maintain that update for it to stay in there. And then we pulled it into this app and said, this is what we're going to use. So if you notice, but this little yellow dots, that is actually VEERS. That's NASA satellite data. So it's not a fire perimeter. That's coming from satellite and it is extremely accurate. However, being a high wind driven event, I'm a very doubting person, having worked with a lot of data. So sometimes I wonder, well, is that really what burned? Because to me, that looks more like the smoke plume. And smoke carries a lot of heat. And so that could be mostly the smoke plume, not knowing what burned. I'm not quite sure if that's the 72,000 acres. Or if they're getting the number 72,000 acres by drawing a polygon around that. There's not quite enough information. I'm a very inquisitive person. I like to know the answers.
It'd be helpful if they put the actual wind vectors. It says 25 to 30 miles per hour, but it doesn't say where it's coming from.
Right, and this is the forecast for the next 24 hours. But the point for the fire started over here.
Ah, of course.
Yeah. The point, now California is an easy one, or used to be. The point for every fire in California was the nearest road intersection because they respond by vehicle to all brush fires. We do too, but we put where the fire is usually. That is either where they were doing their command base or where the dispatch office is, but that point is clearly not where the fire was happening. So then there's no fire perimeter because there's no GIS specialist working on the fire. I know a few fire folks who got ordered to the fire. None of them were GIS because sometimes we are still seen as an extra. We're not carrying a shovel, so therefore it's a struggle sometimes to justify the need. It shouldn't be, because every minute they are dealing with something that relates to location, which means they need our help. which is part of why I like this map, because they can at least get a little bit of intel from it if they need it. Do I have? Okay, this is the Wildfire Aware app live. Which way? There we go. So as I zoom in, zoom out, it is data for the US. They were working on a version for Canada when I left Esri last year, but at the time, the data for the US was so easy to pull together that we stayed with just that extent. So you can go out to Guam, which I discovered there's a couple prescribed burns going on there yesterday. I like to pan around the map, see what's happening in the world. And then Alaska has nothing right now. Obviously, it's a little busy. We'll come talk about that in a minute. But the Nebraska fire is still showing up. And that's what I had clicked on. As I zoom in and out, this number fires in view. So as I change the extent, that updates. And then it has the list. We spent a long time debating this because every news blurb you see, if you're a firefighter, the reports you see, all base the kind of the ranking of the list on acres or containment. And that's fine, but this, when we started building this, was 2 years ago. And there was a really large fire early in the season, 300,000 acres, that then was complete, contained, and done by May before the main part of fire season happens. And so what happens? It stayed at the top of the list all summer. And so then we're like, well, that's not right, because it's not the highest priority. It's not what people are coming to look for. And how do we make the data display what is being asked, answer the question? So we went by personnel, which means number of people working on that incident officially. And that means they're getting paid by whoever's going to pay the bill. So there's a lot of fires in this that you will see if you tinker around with this app that always say no, not reported. That means that they're being locally managed, and like a county fire, for example, or just something smaller, or they're not big enough to meet the threshold for a daily report. And so every day on a bigger fire, I have to help contribute to a set of data such as how many people are on the fire, how many injuries, how many homes threatened, how many homes damaged, how many homes destroyed, how many fatalities, what's the weather, what's the forecast. And they use all of this to help determine who gets resources. And so if we're not doing a daily report, you're not going to have those numbers. So those fires will then thus drop to the bottom of the list because they're dropping in priority below the fires that are big enough to warrant getting a daily report and having personnel. Betty's Way is the name of the fire in Nebraska. So if I click, I'm going to actually pick a different one. Let's go to Oklahoma. That is new yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
So started yesterday, 76,000 acres. 257 people. I do not see a perimeter on that map. If they have a perimeter, it will show up here. The perimeters do take some time to get vetted, so they do take sometimes a couple of hours. It used to take about 18 hours to 24. So through some of the change in data management at the federal level in the US, this is a much faster process, which is why this app is possible. Then it has containment, weather forecast, today, tomorrow. It doesn't say the direction of the wind. However, I'll show you something that does. Population. I actually, who was I talking to? Oh, one of my grad students is working on a tornado map in Ohio. And he was looking at demographics and he was just gonna include all demographics. Well, as an emergency manager, there's two groups I'm interested in. Under 16, over 65. We might need to adjust the over 65 because people are working longer. But typically those are groups that either can't self-evacuate, the under 16s. The much older than 65s usually can't self-evacuate. And they're also not on communication, they're not plugged in, they're at home during the day. So it might be harder to get notifications to them. So those are the two age groups that I'm always interested in. How many of those people live in my area? How good is that data? When was it last collected? It's a rough because it's not perfect. I know in Saratoga, the census happened during the pandemic, and I know a lot of people who just didn't open their door. Although they came to my house 4 times. I was like, you already counted us. They were like, well, we need your info again. I was like, but you already counted us. So who knows what happens with that? But it's, I think there's some things that we want to look at there. And then language, because yes, we will make our maps in Spanish or Tagalog or any other language that we need to make them in. And then housing, what's the median value based on census? And then we get to my favorite part, given my background, is the ecosystem. Because I can look and go, oh, 85% grass? Yeah, it'll be out tomorrow. Other? Not sure what other would be out here. And then wildfire hazard potential. And I made them put an I. Because you can't read that from the back, but the wildfire hazard potential, this is a data layer that gets used across the country and gets mirrored by other countries around the world as the risk. The state of Oregon published a risk map 2 years ago, maybe, and got flogged publicly for it in the media and by residents, because essentially insurance companies were going to use that to say, oh, you're in high risk. We better make your insurance more expensive. But what this is given the perfect storm in fire conditions, the likelihood of the pixel showing extreme fire behavior is low, medium, high. And it's based off of data from 2014. So that's a decade old. If nothing has changed in the environment, then it would maybe still be accurate. But if you're showing drier, wetter, colder, hotter, all of that factors in. If you've developed those pixels differently, if you've landscaped, that affects your property. So California has bills, state bills, for how your house has to be built, what that outside landscaping has to look like. What are the things? Do you have an eave? Do you have all the gutters? We don't have gutters. Like gutters. And there's so many things on the list. It's like pages long. Yeah. Do you have vegetation right up to the base of your foundation? I'm more concerned from working on fires on the Front Range. I'm always more concerned when I see cushions on patio furniture.
Oh.
That stuff just,
Oh.
yep, exactly. I'm like, just throw them away. Those are awful. Biodiversity. So that's what's the percentage or what's the imperiled species? How many imperiled species are in the area that you clicked on? Now, with no fire perimeter, it's searching a 2-mile radius from the fire center, the fire location, that long. And then what public lands there are. And we included public lands because on the Ryan Park fire over between here and Laramie, or here in Walden, the number one question one year on that fire, the public information officers were getting like 300 calls a day. And what was the question? Yes.
Is it still open to hunt?
Yes. Is it still open for hunting? And that is the biggest question we get, starting in late July. Because we have so many people in both Wyoming and Colorado who come from outside areas to hunt. They've invested preference points, they've got their cabins booked, they've got their vacation time set with their bosses. Wanna know, is there a closure? And so we don't import closure data because there's not one consistent layer across the country for it. There might be for the US Forest Service at some point. It does not exist yet. I'm ever hopeful. But yeah, that's this amazing app. I might be biased, but, oh,
You said you were helping develop it, correct? Actually, that the Gatsby fire is encroaching on 283. That's the route I usually drive down to go see my sister in Oklahoma City.
It's this is their busy time. It's kind of normal-ish. For them to be busy at this time of year. Now, the only other thing I'll point out before I switch away is this kind of more layers at the bottom left. Because we put a lot of thought into this. I am in Oklahoma, so you're not gonna see old burn scars as much in here, but we have old burn scars. The darker the polygon, the more recent. Why? Because if you walk outside and you look on the ground, it looks darker. And so we symbolized it that same way. That's not typical in burn fire history data sets when you see it on a map. Very rarely are the cartographers thinking about the audience and their experience with fire. Usually they're working in fire and they are like, oh, it's often different shades of red. It's not burning anymore. So we didn't want to do that. I've also seen it like rainbow unicorn colors, which is pretty common in fire. They've not taken cartography classes. That's not required. The big thing is to, I go back. Let me go back a couple slides.
So what I'm getting at this is we need more cartographers in fire and we need more fire in cartography.
We need more cartography and fire. Yes, and we need more people who know how to use a plotter. Because we still plot. Yes, we've got amazing technology available to us. No, it does not work in the woods when you are covered in dirt and grime. So the phones work. We're using them for data collection and they lift that load. However, batteries die and phones get run over by engines really easily. And so you find a way, if it is breakable, it will break. A piece of paper, if you tear it in half, you can still use it. So we still print, and this guy we broke the plotter and he was called the plotter doctor. And he came and he showed up in scrubs. It was fantastic. I've never
So is that coming out of those IV bags?
It's IV bags with ink, yes. It was perhaps one of the highlights of 2011.
That's hilarious.
I've never seen anything like it since, but the reality is, like, I've pulled apart a plotter with the manual and gone to Home Depot to buy replacement tubes to hook it back up and make it run because you can't get parts. So being able to troubleshoot, not being afraid to pull something apart. What I learned when we got into teaching, got into kind of teaching firefighters how to use field maps and survey 123, and some of them are using quick capture, and we used Ovenza for years. Then teaching them how to use those tools, firefighters are not afraid. They're gonna push every button and either it breaks it or it works. And GIS folks are much more cautious because we know that things can break sometimes. So trying to teach the GIS specialists how to set up the maps was the harder task. And saying, oh, you know, it's okay. Click all the buttons. If you break it, you just start over. And so there are templates for fire. That's one of the beautiful things is fire has a standard operating procedure that does not exist for other disaster types. Search and rescue, mountain search and rescue has a similar GIS protocol, but they're not as well supported, they're volunteer-based, and so there's not the financial support to be able to train and have software and bring in GIS folks. For fire, we do have that. For emergency management, there's a lot of folks who have taken over kind of the standard operating procedures for GIS on fires and applied them across the board to other hazards. I used what we do on fire. We have folder structures, naming conventions, database structures, and I used all of that in all of my day jobs. So if you were like following me and taking over any project I've ever worked on, all the folders look the same. And that way I know how to hand it off and transfer it. Why? Because when I'm on a fire, I'm there for 14 days. And don't call me on day 15 because I won't answer my phone. And that's how it has to be, because otherwise we would get the calls. And so you are assigned to an incident. When you are not assigned, they won't call you because they know the rules, because that's somebody else's fire at that point. The fire, there was a big fire in New Mexico. I think they said it was probably around 80 different GIS specialists worked on that fire. That's a lot of hands touching data.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Sort of how things get operationalized when this happens, you know? So there's like 80 some GIS folks, but like, where does it start? And how does the person in the Forest Service in Denver talk to the person on the ground in Ryan's Park and the Homeland Security Office in Cheyenne and the county emergency management manager in Carbon County in Rollins or something like that? Like, how does that all work? And does it work smoothly?
It did not used to work smoothly. And I have to say it doesn't always still work smoothly because a lot of it starts at the local level. And so when you get smoke in the air, what happens? Somebody calls 911. When that fire gets reported, it gets a point. That point has a lat long. It's not always right, but it's approximate. It's close. Once you're there, you can find the smoke. That lat long enters in and gets scraped. So there's a behind the scenes process that's scraping every wildfire instance in the US. And I think every state is now in part of that process. They brought state by state on until it was complete. And that's been going on for a long time. Now, once that data ended up in one database, it didn't go anywhere for a number of years. It was like, well, now what do we do? We've got all the points in one layer. Yeah, so now that's what's feeding in to a lot of data sets that are out there. And so they're all pulling from that same source. That has a unique ID field, a GUID or GUID, depending on where you learn to say the word. And that ID is unique to that fire. Now, when I go to a fire, I have a resource qualification list, and I now have a row that says that unique ID, I was there for 7 days performing this task. So either GIS, I'm also a public information officer and planning section chief trainee. So they tried to tie it all together behind the scenes using an IRWIN ID. IRWIN is integrated reporting acronym that has a lot more words into it. It doesn't work terribly well. There was a fire, I mean, it works really well for the federal lands. There was a fire, I want to say near Woods Landing, just a small one, couple acres, but that still needs to get reported. Why? because they got the fire out in an hour. But we need to know it for models. We can't adjust our models. We can't adjust the prediction. We can't know what's happening on the landscape and how different climatic events are affecting our propensity for new fires if we don't track every fire and how big it is and what kind of fuels it was burning and how severely it was burning. And so that fire was county run. Might have been, actually it was over by Cheyenne, I think. It was like, a little ranch fire, grass fire, got put out, but it was enough that I saw the smoke from I-80. And so I ask every time I see a fire, as soon as I saw this, I texted somebody, I was like, did this make it on the map yet? I was like, I'm driving, I can't check, talk to text. And they were like, nope, not yet. And I was like, okay. It's like, well, in order for them to order resources from outside of the county, they have to get it into the system. And so it must be a kind of an official record. Now, they still count the acres. So that fire by Cheyenne still got counted when they report up to the feds to say, hey, we burned this many acres, because that's considered treatment of the land. And that's considered an accomplishment for the year, because they're asked to treat the land, and fire takes away from the acres that are available for either logging or prescribed burn. So they get to subtract that. So they all include the number of acres. They just don't always tell you where. In Florida, this was a problem because they burn actually more acres than anyone else. They just don't burn houses. So you don't hear about them on the news. But Florida, because when they burn, you can reburn very soon, because it's quite green, they do more prescribed burning. Northern Florida, where the quail are, early settlers learned that they had to burn every 1 to 3 years to have quail to be able to hunt. And so how can you have a party and go hunting for birds if you don't have any birds and the birds need fire? So they figured all this out in the early settlements of that area and burned for habitat. And they still burn for habitat. Most of Florida gets burned at some point in a 3 to 5 year cycle. So, but if they don't map it, in 3 days it's green and you can't even find it on the satellite. So they haven't, what did they do? It was a really cool project. The state managed it and they set it up so it's an automatic detection, running change detection on their imagery, and they just have it running, and they have a couple people checking the burn permits. Because everybody who burns has to have a permit in the country for air quality and pollution. So if the conditions are such so the smoke is going to sit, you're not allowed to burn. So they have this process, had a little bit of human QA/QC, and it's been working pretty well for a couple of years now. So for this bigger picture, once I go as a GIS person to the fire, all of this data is in ArcGIS Online. So when I create a perimeter, I'm creating it in Pro or any other tool that I want. As long as I upload it or copy and paste it into, I get sent KMLs. There's a lot of little fires that don't have GIS support. Sometimes I operate on a regional support ticket. That just means that they leave it open and I could support multiple fires at a time. They just call me, they text me a KML. They're like, hey, we made this. Here's the perimeter. And I'm like, okay, so I just copy and paste it.
How do they make it?
A lot of them are using aircraft in Colorado. So they have a multi-mission aircraft that has infrared, and they're digitizing in Google Earth. Yep. And so if they were digitizing in something else, then we wouldn't be able to remove me as a middle person, which would be faster. But their systems all run, I think they all run Google Earth. There's a couple other systems that they do. Some of them are using phone apps that aren't tied to Arc, so that they're not part of the enterprise. They're trying to shift all those folks to remove that gap and that lag. Because ideally, if somebody was using field maps or a survey, then they're creating that perimeter and it's immediately available. It takes 15 minutes for it to get through the whole cycle, but it shows up in all the data feeds within 15 minutes usually.
Chris, I'll interrupt you for Fern. Sorry.
That's right.
5 till 1,
Okay,
or well, 6 till.
all right.
That's why you wanna have some questions, more questions.
Yeah, we can do questions. I made it through half of my slides. That's
Well,
They're guidelines. Let me scroll through and see if there was anything critical. How do I, is there a way for me to look at them here? Here we go. So part of it is that fire falls under emergency management. And emergency management has a cycle. Everybody likes to say that they start with mitigation and preparedness. They only do that after they've had an incident.
Yeah, sounds that.
Yes. Usually it takes an incident for people, for communities to get the funding, apply for the grants. Grant money is out there. A lot of it now is tied towards GIS. Community wildfire protection plans. This is a GIS exercise in mapping. Almost every community in our county in the West has one. The East doesn't, and they got a couple $2 billion of it made available last year so that they could all try and apply for the grant money to make their own. So I made a hub template before I left Esri, just to help facilitate those people who don't know what it, like, at a county reach out. I don't know what this is. And I was like, that's okay, here, just use this, plug and play. Insert your data, insert your terms, your county's name, and it's the base. It meets the minimum requirements. Response gets all the glory and all the money. And it's usually the most fun as a GIS specialist. And then does anybody think Tennessee has a lot of fires?
I feel like it has potential depending on the season.
Do you know where Gatlinburg is? Heard of Dolly Parton? Dollywood?
Hollywood.
In 2016, there was a fire that started on the 23rd of November. Thanksgiving was the 24th. It is a tourist town. There were 25,000 or something extra people in town. The fire just kind of did its own little thing on the mountaintop in the park. Thankfully, it waited until Monday morning because it destroyed 2,500 homes. That's 2,500 condos mostly in a matter of hours. And so that community, there are recordings of their GIS manager. She is an office of 1.5 because she is a part-time employee. She completely changed what they do now for disasters. I spent a couple weeks on site with her. And they still have fires, but they completely changed their entire countywide workflow. And while I was there, we shared a public map, not really knowing how popular Gatlinburg really was. It had 1.5 million hits in the first 30 minutes and brought down the whole ArcGIS online. So from that, we have best practices that are available. So if you are ever going to publish a public-facing product, it should be perfect. But you don't always have time. So there is a blog that is constantly updated based on the infrastructure behind the scenes that Esri maintains. And so it says, these are the things, caching. Is it editable? They don't even allow that anymore. I need a thing for that because I accidentally did it. There's a lot of things in there that were hard lessons learned that we learned through disaster response. And that's what benefits overall ArcGIS because we're running into the issues head first and find them. But that's it. I know we're up against the time, so some folks have to leave. But
Yeah, well, we can entertain some questions, but thank you very much. Yeah, those who might have to go to class or, like, you have questions.
So, you mentioned that you, got your degree from Johns Hopkins University. and you
I'm
were talking-
teaching at Johns Hopkins.
Oh, you're teaching at Johns Hopkins.
My
okay.
degree is just down the street at CSU.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
You're teaching at Johns Hopkins University, and I know that Johns Hopkins University, they had a pretty famous dashboard that became the centerpiece of the COVID-19 crisis.
It did.
Do you think that your work in Gatlinburg may have influenced the procedures for managing that particular dashboard when it
Yes.
went and exploded?
They absolutely did, yeah, because we worked very closely with them before they shared that. That February, I was presenting in Texas at a wildfire conference, and it was late, it was this exact same day. And I got a text from my boss that said, hey, you're the only person who's actually made these ArcGIS hubs so far on our team. He was like, I want you to make one for this COVID thing that just started happening in Seattle.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay. So I gave my presentation, and then the whole conference got shut down because they were all emergency responders and they were all being called just as I was. And so we all broke apart, and I ended up creating the Esri COVID hub, which was a massive project, 120 hours a week is what I was working for about 6 months. And then the rest of my team supported Johns Hopkins because I didn't have the bandwidth to do that as well.
Kind of a similar question, maybe. I think Esri is a great company, and I love what they have pulled together with the Living Atlas and all of the apps that they provide. But then a part of my brain is like, it's really surprising that like the app that you showed wasn't like a government website, like run by, I don't know, interagency fire
Yeah, absolutely.
team or by FEMA or something like that. Like,
So the Forest
what's
Service was
kind of
working.
going on there?
Yeah, the Forest Service was working on something similar, and the Esri Living Atlas team actually has a series of these aware apps. So there's sea ice aware, earthquake aware, hurricane aware, and wildfire aware was the most recent one. Most of them were done, they were created to say, hey, here's the data. If you don't know what you could do with the data, here's an example.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where they started. And then with the wildfire one, we met with the Forest Service and we were like, hey, we're working on this. And they were like, oh, thank goodness. They're like, because they were kind of starting to go down that route. And they said, can you also add these layers? So we added carbon and we added another layer in there. And so in areas that their data set covers, there's a couple extra little things in there that we added just for them so that they wouldn't have to duplicate that and make the app. But I agree with you, there's a single ArcGIS online organization that is used for wildfire in the US. And that is the only one that is interagency and that is like contractually allowed to be interagency through Esri and has unlimited users. And so every firefighter, I know there's at least like 25 to 30,000 people in that organization. And so it's fairly locked down because it's a lot to manage. But they also don't have the bandwidth. They only have a few full-time staff to manage and support that and support all the firefighters and the GIS folks who are constantly breaking things and going through, like right now, we're all going through our recertification. So that means we all have to run through a training version of that fire data set and simulate being on a fire. And so you've got people all over the country, there's over 1,000 of us who are all running through the process, clicking away, testing out the new layer for 2024 and making sure it works. And that's a lot for them to manage. So they don't have the bandwidth to create products. And their mission is really just for during the 14-day assignment support. And so that creation of products does fall on the agencies. And I think they're all kind of going, well, why don't you make it? Why don't you make it? And kind of leaving that gap. And so that's where Esri the Living Atlas team on the environment team, I don't know some of the other teams, but the environment team, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
And they just look at it, they're like, well, what else could we do with the data? And so that's kind of an exercise in what can we do with the data and how can we make it a single single stop. That being said, there is a similar product behind the scenes behind a login just for fire. And it actually was developed by a company out of Colorado Springs. And it uses all those same data layers. But they have it locked down because there's like 2 or 3 additional layers that are not allowed to be public. Lightning data is one that's not a publicly available data set. Not typically. Anybody know why? Who's the biggest purchaser of lightning data?
The National Weather Service.
Insurance. Close. They're the second. Oh, God.
Oh, of course.
Last thing you want is for some famous golfer to get struck by lightning. So
They're
golf
swinging around in a
courses,
big metal
and they've
club.
got the money, so they pay for lightning data. So therefore, the providers of lightning data don't want it to be publicly available because that takes away from their business. So fire gets it for free or for a contract that the Bureau of Land Management negotiates every year. But that doesn't mean that we can share it out. So we do have some of those kind of contractual data layers that we get access to that are behind the scenes, that are in that specific app. But then people are going from one login to another, and you imagine that's a firefighter's favorite thing to do.
Oh.
How does the app you shared with us compare to, is it InsiWeb or something?
InsiWeb?
Yeah, like, cause that one feels like it's a federal.
Yeah, so InsiWeb, let me, how do I use this?
Yeah.
We're getting class.
That's all right.
I stopped sharing, so you can put that stick around.
I've seen the app before, if you, I mean.
Okay. This, still. Split screen, see you later. There we go. Okay, so InsiWeb, now everybody's trying to class. See web is the federal official data sharing from the public information officers. So that's going to include like the text, the dialogue. The app that I shared, the Wildfire Aware, is strictly data. And so
What data, sorry?
it's strictly data.
Strictly, okay.
So when I come in, the Nebraska fire isn't even displayed because they don't have a public information officer working on that fire. And so somebody has to be working on the fire and decide that it's big enough to put in information and that they're going to maintain this site. And then once the fire, so in the Rocky Mountain region, we have a couple of incident management teams at the higher complexity level. So that means bigger fires or more impactful to humans. And if they leave the fire, they have to have somebody to hand this off to. And if they don't, usually the locals won't take it over, so they shut it down. Whereas the other is based purely on data feeds that are being updated throughout the life cycle of the fire.
The data you're using in that Esri app, are you getting it from these guys then?
They're getting it from the same place that we're getting it from. Yeah, so these points and perimeters on the fire all come from that same behind the scenes data black box called Irwin.
So the Living Atlas one is gonna have more information on it.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't go to,
in some
I won't go to
sense.
InsiWeb anymore. I have to look at the Living Atlas one.
They're different because the InsiWeb one will have the evacuation information.
Right. I
And
just need
it'll
like.
have photos and videos and briefings and so they are different. There's just one strictly based on data layers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fern. That was really, really.
Yeah.
Who knew it all could like impact on
Yeah.
It's every 6 months, because they're, take that parking lot, it's like we have the dorms, the new dorms on there. But parking lot, which I don't think we're ever gonna be able to use it, and nobody can use it. It's still in the landscape.
So the thing about that intersection.